Welcome, everyone, to CLI's Legal Generative AI Summit 2023. I'm Maya Markovich, the Executive Director of the Justice Technology Association, and I'll be your host for this panel discussion. I would like to acknowledge on behalf of the Center, the College of Law, myself, and our panel, the traditional custodians of the lands in all the places on which we meet for the summit today. We pay respect to elders past and present, and we acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining this session. We also acknowledge and welcome all First Nations people from every country joining us for this session. This session is focusing on unlocking justice, the potential and perils of generative AI in improving access to justice. And we'll be discussing it with our panelists. We have Amy Burton, head of pro bono at Mills Oakley and managing lawyer of Everyday Justice,
Hi.
Laura Elliott, pro bono senior associate at DLA Piper, Daniel Gelzavash, associate professor, UNSW Law and Justice, and Noel Lim, co-founder and CEO of Annika Legal. We've heard the stats and see every day the increasing and critical need to improve access to justice. There is so much that generative AI can do to help, but it's not a perfect solution, or is it? So in this session, we're going to analyze and discuss the impact of generative AI and access to justice with this incredible panel of community, legal sector, pro bono, and low bono specialists. So why don't we start off by talking a little bit about the opportunities that are presented in generative AI in improving access to justice. So in my mind, they come from a few different categories. And I think maybe the first and most obvious one would be content generation. Before we do that, though, I think we need to talk about the fundamental differences between generative AI in access to justice versus private law. Would anyone, Noel, would you like to jump in on this first before we start talking about the specifics of content generation?
Yeah, for sure. I think there is a fundamental difference between access to justice, private law, which stems from the fact that clients aren't paying for the legal services, and that has a few pretty big implications. And often, these clients aren't paying. The alternative to not getting this legal services is just often not getting help at all. And so, when you see that, the stats in the US are that less than 10% of people actually get the legal help that they need. It's I've seen similar things in Australia. That is that leads to this thing of maybe there is a lower standard of quality required. If most people aren't getting the legal help that they need, maybe in this sector, legal assistance only needs to be better than not getting any help at all. And that, that definitely has as long as this doesn't put you in a worse situation, it's all right. And that's quite a different way of looking at legal services. A few other things to note, I would say, are there's a different customer in access to justice, and that is basically the funder of the services, so the government or philanthropy, and it's all still in service of the clients who need the legal help. But because there is a different customer, there's a bit more misalignment, because you've got what the client needs, which might be slightly different from what the funder thinks they need or is able to fund. And then, of course, what the legal services are providing. And the last point, which I think is worth mentioning, is that in access to justice, it is more important to get, it's vital to get the sole solution right, because it is, designed to be a collaborative sector. Everyone's trying to improve access to justice. We think, okay, well, let's not duplicate services. Why have two services that do the same thing when we can just have, pool our resources, have two services that do two different things? But that kind of means that there's only really one solution for each problem. And so if that solution doesn't work very well, it means that everyone with that problem is going to get a subpar solution. And therefore, we got to really get the one solution right. Otherwise, it's bad news for everyone who might come across that problem.
I mean, that's a really good point, right? I mean, I think that the access to justice technology sector is as susceptible as any other sector when it comes to market market pressures and market influences. Dan, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this? Not to put you on the spot, but if anyone would like to jump in on kind of the frame up before we get to specifics, happy to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Maya. And no, that was a great summary of the key issues. I think what complicates things a little bit is, that premise that, any better than the baseline now is a good thing. I completely agree with in principle, but I don't think the regulations of the sector kind of align with that. And so the trouble you run into is, even if you can do something much better than the status quo, there's still legal risk you take on if you're giving information that's relied upon to the detriment of the client. And so balancing those two imperatives is like the tightrope that the access to justice sector is walking right now.
It's true, and we will definitely be getting to that in more detail when we talk about the risks. I think that's a really important point to realize. I mean, there are risks and opportunities, but it has to be kind of conducted carefully, obviously, for the benefit of the consumer. Actually, maybe continuing with you a little bit, Dan. I know we talked a little bit in our prep call about kind of this what people sort of initially are thinking of, I think, when they come. So, things like content generation, things like writing a demand letter, form completion, drafting and updating materials for self-help providers. Any examples that you've seen or used along these lines that you'd like to share with the group?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good at the outset to kind of distinguish between the use of generative AI by lawyers, and we know that that those back-end use is happening with proprietary products that have generative AI components in the commercial sector. I'm not sort of aware of that of those sort of solutions being deployed in the access to justice sector just yet, but that's not to say there's not lawyers that are using the sort of standard tools that are available, like ChatGPT, to do those tasks. But I know there are projects underway exploring various use cases for generative AI. So one of my main areas of interest is in the written refugee law, and I know there's projects underway for drafting, doing a first draft of a review application for refugee protection claims. And they are generally focusing on jurisdictions where people currently don't have any access to legal advice or very limited access. And the idea is, if you can generate the first draft, then the very limited lawyers that are available would be able to help more people. On the other side is the sort of direct to consumer self-help tools. And again, I mean, there's a number of projects underway that that are sort of designed for the legal domain, which we can talk about more, but none of them, to my knowledge, have gone to market. But we know, as was discussed in Jordan's excellent panel, there's people are already going to ChatGPT to get answers to their legal questions, and they're already using ChatGPT for content generation. And one of my other areas of interest is in complaint making, and in that area in particular, we know that people are using ChatGPT to generate particularly consumer complaints, and that anecdotally it seems like there's been a big increase in complaints made to companies because it's just so much easier for people, that the barriers are much lower to making those complaints. But interestingly, there's also reports that some companies are using ChatGPT to write the responses to the complaint. So which raises some interesting ethical and practical dilemmas.
Indeed. Would anyone else like to jump in on this, on the kind of the content generation? If there are any examples that you've come across, if anyone thinks of any, please don't hesitate to jump in. We don't have to go in order or stand on ceremony. Yeah, go ahead, please, Amy.
Not so much on what I've seen, but what I'd love to see. I think this is a big thing in the access to justice space in Australia is we're hearing a lot about what ChatGPT could do. And I think at the moment, a lot of community legal services are at the point where we're still deciding how can we use this? How can we find the resources and the time to figure out how we use this? And so within my team, so I run a national community legal service called Everyday Justice, and it's funded by Mills Oakley. And last year we received over 2,000 inquiries for our service. But and what we're using at the moment to try to deal with the number of clients who want to speak to us is that we've got an automated client intake bot that we've developed with the help of Joseph Legal. But it's not generative AI, it's automated. But even at that point, and most of our clients at least try to contact us through the client intake chat, and it saves us a lot of time. But what I would love to see is much more automation, hopefully through the use of generative AI, of working out what a proposed client actually needs from us. A lot of the clients who speak to us don't even really know when they're contacting us what they need from a lawyer, and it takes, so even if we're able to automate that intake discussion with the client to get the initial details, it then takes one of us at Everyday Justice to have a phone call with the client to really tease out what we need. So if there was a way we could harness generative AI to have that front end discussion with the client about important dates, other parties involved in a matter, what practice area we're even dealing with, what court they might be have a matter in, and often our clients send us hundreds of documents that they're expecting us to review. If there was a way for generative AI to go through that and prepare chronologies to help us triage the matters that we're looking at to work, and to tell us which ones we should be prioritizing over others, and then to help us communicate with prospective clients as to how long it might take us to get back to them about things. Because I find that with our service, that's the biggest, it's like a pipeline. We've got so many people wanting to speak to us, and we can only help so many, but it's taking a lot of time at the start to make that initial assessment. And I see a lot of community legal centres with wait times of 6 to 8 weeks at the earliest. And I'd love to see if there was a way for generative AI to reduce that front end time that it's taking us.
Well, Amy, I mean, that's a wonderful point, and that actually is one of the other categories that I was thinking that I'd like to dive into a little bit. So thank you for that perfect segue. Another main use case for generative AI for access to justice is just what you're describing in many ways, analysis and extraction. So like anything from, reviewing records that now take several days, or anywhere, anything down to, finding the most relevant cases to cite, proposing the best case strategy, and really kind of winnowing down the intake process and as elaborate or concise as it may be for a particular organization. Noel, I know that we talked a little bit about the fact that access to unstructured data for trends is very useful for systemic advocacy. And what are your thoughts on that with respect to access to justice? It's never really been done before.
Yeah, I think that this is potentially one of the biggest opportunities in my view. So, you mentioned that, like the legal industry is, I think it might be like number one or top 3 for disruption by generative AI. And I think that's largely because it's predominantly text-based, and the data that is captured is almost always unstructured. Well, the vast majority is, and that's just everything in all the correspondence, the letters, and So if like using generative AI to essentially just supercharge your ability to query effectively has really great opportunities in data-driven systemic advocacy and service design generally. So like an example of this is we have we've got all of these. So I work at Annika Legal. We're a nonprofit legal service assisting predominantly renters. And we looked through all of the cases of a certain type and found out that 40% of the cases didn't proceed because they were too scared to go to the tribunal. Now, that took us a really long time to mine all that data. Like, it's looking through the file notes and the case notes and saying, okay, why did they not go? Like, which ones didn't go? Why did they not go? Was it because they were too scared? But when we figured out that insight, we thought, oh, all right, well, of these unsuccessful cases, 40% of them are failing because before they even get into the tribunal. But there's no duty lawyer is going to help at that stage. They're just not getting in the door. That let us get funding to run this pilot to provide an additional layer of support to get these renters through the door. And so that's an example of how service design can be improved when you take this data-driven approach, but we're not going to be able to mine for every single stat. We just kind of got lucky with that one. With generative AI being used as a, I guess to like query for these types of insights, massive implications on the, I guess how it can inform our service design. And I think pretty much exactly in the same way, how it can inform our systemic advocacy. So
Yeah.
this, the example of that, it can just be as simple as, all right, of the cases, how many of the clients have negative health effects because of the quality of their house? How many of those relate to mold and respiratory illnesses? Okay, great. From there, we know that maybe there is an evidence base for changing the system, like the policy to stop this from happening, or at least providing a health-based remedy for the people who suffer that. And so at the moment, a very resource-constrained sector struggles to do that, but might not do so if we had that capability through generative AI.
Yeah. Yeah. And along those same lines, Dan, for generative AI and judicial analytics, I know you've were describing some of the work of the Caldor Data Lab, identifying, using generative AI to identify structural issues and biases, and also inform case strategy by democratizing that access to judicial analytics, which heretofore is only accessible through expensive proprietary products. Any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe just a brief explanation of what we mean by judicial analytics here. So this is sort of capturing data on case characteristics and how specific judges or legal decision makers decide cases with those types of characteristics. And so at the Caldor Data Lab, we've been collating these sorts of statistics on the refugee, the review of refugee cases in Australia, both at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and at the Federal Circuit and Family Court. And we have been relying on, up until now, natural language processing, which is great for getting some data from the metadata in published cases. But generative AI really provides an opportunity to get much more nuanced information from the actual unstructured text in the case. And not only is that, so it has a lot of implications in terms of I guess evening the playing field when it comes to access to this sort of data. We know, as you said, Maya, that the proprietary companies are providing access to this at generally a very high cost. And there was a time when there was a big gap between people who don't afford lawyers and people who afford expensive lawyers. But I think it's increasingly going to be the gap between people who can afford lawyers with access to judicial analytics and people who can't afford those lawyers. And the process for collecting the judicial analytics that has been used in the past has been extremely resource intensive. But generative AI really makes it very easy. And so not just in the refugee stage, you could use these tools across any area of law that you're interested in, get really nuanced insights that can not only form your individual case strategy, but the second use case, as Noel mentioned, is kind of identifying systemic issues and inconsistencies and biases in the legal system.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, it's a tough nut to crack. And one other thing that's related to this, I think that's important to kind of mention is this kind of the translation and simplification of complex text into plain language. Things like, summarizing the judicial opinion, tailoring it to a particular reading level, simplifying content on a law help website, translating it into different languages, that kind of thing. Laura, I know that you had some thoughts on this with respect to the accessibility of the legal information and services, and how it's very difficult to find the right legal information in an accessible format. Any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, lots of thoughts. I think it ties back to what Jordan was talking about in the session earlier, that traditionally the legal system has been set up to be this external, inaccessible thing that is kind of gate-kept by this small group of people who know how to use it and interact with it, and therefore charge a very high price for doing so. And so I see a massive opportunity for generative AI to make legal information more accessible, but more easy to find. I think if anyone's ever had a legal problem, even if you've had a legal training, it's often difficult to find the information that you need in a way that you can understand it. I was recently trying to understand tax implications of moving to another country, and trying to understand it, even though, you know, with a law degree and being a lawyer, is so difficult. So the ability for generative AI to, you know, look through massive amounts of information and present it to people in a way that's really clear and understandable and at least points them in the right direction is a massive opportunity. And really, as Jordan said, lets people take their legal issues and their experience with the legal system into their own hands. And I just want to touch on what Amy was talking about, and we have this huge bottleneck across the legal assistance sector more generally of all of these people who need legal help. And as Noel mentioned, barely anyone getting to the services they need, and barely anyone getting to the right services. Because, you know, you can access legal services and information, but connecting with quality legal assistance is a whole other ballgame in itself. And I am a lawyer at DLA Piper, but I've also been a long-term secondee to Justice Connect in the innovation team, who are doing some really amazing work in this space. And a tool that they've been working on with the University of Melbourne is a natural language processor, which has been trained on thousands and thousands of samples collected over Justice Connect's time as a clearinghouse. And what it does is it allows people to put in their description of their issue in their natural language, in their own language, so their own words about what's going on in their life, and tell you the kind of areas of law and the legal problems that exist, or if it's not a legal problem at all. And then it helps to direct that person to the right services. So it kind of assists in streamlining that triage process, which I think is really exciting. So there's definitely starting to be work done in this space, and there's such a huge opportunity to better connect people that need legal help with the right legal help.
I agreed, and I can't wait to see, you know, as the Justice Technology Association is a trade organization based on that represents, you know, ethical organizations creating business to consumer technology to help individuals through some legal process without a lawyer. My hope is that one day the intake process and those kinds of workflows in community organizations will also be able to kind of feel confident in piping as part of their intake, including the pipeline towards some vetted ethical justice tech companies, because I think there's always going to be room for a multiple types of solutions, just based on how incredibly dire and how huge the need is. Dan, I know something you were talking about also with voice to text capabilities. Is there anything you wanted to just add on to this topic? We've got some really great questions, by the way, coming in the Q&A, which I'll get to momentarily. But before we do, Dan, what was your thinking on
yeah, just, I mean, I think I want to add two things to Laura's excellent reflections there. One is sort of as well as simplifying the legal information, the sort of voice to text combined with sort of translation, live translation capabilities mean that, you know, people could be able to talk about their legal problems in their native language and feed directly into the whatever the triage solution or the self-help tool, which would be a huge game changer, because, you know, language and literacy skills are often the main barriers that people point to when you talk about using technology, access to justice. Obviously, it doesn't get over the limits around whether people have access to smartphones to be able to do that, but it does overcome those concerns around literacy and language skills. Laura's discussion on so I guess it was what I refer to as legal diagnosis, and I think that is going to be one of the biggest game changers when it comes to applications of generative AI. It has huge benefits in terms of legal organizations and organizations like Justice Connect to connect people with lawyers, in terms of, and, you know, as Amy mentioned in the work of organizations where they even internally being able to see whether a person's legal problem meets the services that you provide, and also who within your team to connect them to. But it's also opportunities to go direct to consumers to help them find legal information. And so we've got a project formerly known as Tech for Justice. We just rebranded to Just Complaints, and it helps people in Australia identify out of the 300 and so government complaints bodies we have, which one would be most appropriate for their needs. And basically the idea is you go in, you type in your own words, what happened to you, and using generative AI, it will identify the appropriate complaint bodies for you that may be open to you, noting that there will often be more than one, and kind of listing some of the pros and cons of going down the different paths. But it's already, we don't have to start reinvent the wheel here as well. I mean, generative AI is already being used for in very similar ways in other areas, and I think medical diagnosis is the best example from which we can draw on in terms of the principles are very similar in terms of matching the free text input in terms of someone's problem to very complex, detailed specifications about different medical conditions.
Indeed, and actually that, and your mention of actually multiple mentions so far of kind of the input versus output. When we had a great question that came in the Q&A, I'll just throw it out to the panelists. Why not do it in the middle of our presentation? The question is, given ChatGPT uses queries inputted to train the bot, which means it becomes part of the pool of public information, has anybody thought about the confidentiality and legal professional privilege as a starting point when using tools like ChatGPT? I see Laura nodding.
I think
Would you like to start off?
Legal profession has thought about this, and I think it's one of the main contributors to the hesitancy of the profession to really embrace tools like ChatGPT, and why a lot of firms have created their own proprietary tools, which kind of the layer between GPT-4 and kind of client data. I think no client data should be put into ChatGPT ever. I think that's something that you hear very often in any presentation about generative AI, because of there's no clarity on how it's used, how long it's stored, where it's stored, who it's shared with, all of that kind of thing. So yeah, I think this is one of the biggest considerations for me, and something we'll probably talk about when we get to the risks of using generative AI tools that currently exist for inputting personal information and client information, just because there is a huge risk and question mark about it all, and why we need to be looking at creating tools that are safe to use, that are made sure that information is dealt with in a really it's a way that aligns with our ethical obligations as lawyers. But I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Laura did a great job of identifying the risks, but I just want to say they're not insurmountable, and there are options available either through the proprietary products where you can pay to ensure that the model's not being trained using your data. But I think the much better approach is, I'm a big advocate for the open source large language models, and the benefits with some of them are that you don't have to rely on everything being sent to the cloud, and you can run them on your own servers, and so I guess firewall them against sharing anything online, and that can create a safer environment. It comes with additional risks, because then you have to manage all the cybersecurity risks and other risks of managing the data on your own servers. But I think in access to justice space in particular, beyond that issue around sort of data sovereignty and maintaining confidentiality, I think we should be focusing more on the open source models and the opportunities they provide, because obviously the cost implications for the proprietary models are quite prohibitive, but also the open source models are more easy to tinker with and fine tune, and depending on how we train them, and as long as we don't train them using confidential data, we can also use them as a shared resource across the access to justice sector.
Agreed. And actually, as somewhat of a follow-up to that in a more granular fashion, I think it's important to think about kind of the the tools that we are using and whether or not we actually need generative AI for some of the things that we're talking about. So we got a great question about the pattern identification that Noel mentioned. Does it necessarily need generative AI responses, or how would it be better or different than done if that same task were done through capturing key tags and information at intake? Is it just a matter of scaling it, or is there more to it than that, Noel?
Yeah, I think the main difference would be just the accuracy of the query. Like if you are trying to pick up something like fear in a tribunal, like fear in a tribunal setting, preventing you from doing the action, that's not going to, you know, what tag are you going to use to pick that up? And I think it's absolutely possible to try and probably get some okay results. Generative AI poses the, I guess, the opportunity of doing it extremely accurately with, again, minimal, with minimal effort. So no, I think that's the case with probably most of the like sort of service efficiencies and opportunities that we're talking about. Like lo-fi things can be done, but if we find something worth building the generative AI capability for, it's like it seems like it'll do a much better job. We just got to really pick very carefully because of the amount of resources required to build the capability for one of these use cases.
And also, you know, that, you know, applying tags whilst it is useful relies on humans to do it accurately. And I found in the past that that is not always done properly, and it leads to, I guess, incorrect data or incorrect analysis because what you're putting in is incomplete. And I know things like Microsoft Copilot can do pretty scary stuff like sentiment analysis. It can listen in on meetings and tell you what the tone of the meeting was, if there were issues. Like it can do all of that kind of thing. Obviously, there's a whole heap of implications for that kind of thing, but it can do so much more than the traditional methods of data collection that we've ever used.
Can I give a very concrete example in terms of the possibilities and I guess limitations of the non-generative AI approaches? So in the judicial analytics work, we were interested in extracting and timestamping key dates in the applicant's journey in terms of the day they left their country, the date they applied for their protection visa, the data review, and we tried very hard and brought in data. We brought a big team to try and do that using natural language processing. But just because the dates are presented in such different ways and described in such different ways, there was no way we could get that data. And now we're trialing using generative AI for that same purpose. And given it's so much better at parsing regular language and matching it to what your query is, that it can do it on that particular point, operates very accurately.
Great. Oh, thank you, everybody, on that one. Let's move on to the next section, kind of the themes that we wanted to make sure to cover today. Obstacles to deploying generative AI in the access to justice space. One that comes immediately to mind, of course, is that not everybody has access to the technology that's required in order to leverage it for their own best uses. There are a few other ones that I wanted to touch on. Specifically, we already talked about that fear and skepticism. Noel and Laura, did you want to add anything on that?
I think, we're still at the initial stages where it's a bit scary, but I do think it'll become so commonplace that no one will think twice about it in the future. Hopefully, that's what I hope anyway.
Yeah, agreed. Another one I think we should make sure to touch on, of course, almost the elephant in the room, is the prohibitive costs and lack of funding. So, there's the not-for-profit practices are very stretched. They're focusing mainly on casework as much as possible to just try to stem the tide of the need that they're trying to provide relief for. And just that time and resource capacity of these organizations to invest in what it takes to kind of do the R&D required to confidently roll it out. If anyone would like to chime in on that, that would be great.
Yeah, look, I think like in my opinion, it's just the biggest obstacle. I think actually everyone in this call was at a roundtable hosted by CLI about use of generative AI in the access to justice space. And my read from that was that people are knowledgeable about it. It is not a priority for anyone. And
Right.
that's because everyone's priority is keeping their head above water in a very resource constrained um, very resource constrained sector. And so
Yeah.
when you're not thinking about these big projects, which like don't have a high, like you don't really have high level of confidence in yet because it's still early days with this technology. So how are we going to prioritize that against making sure that your staff keep getting paid? I think to make matters even tougher, you've also got the fact that like obviously the tech is expensive, or at least like the people to build
Right.
it is very expensive, but you've got a not-for-profit funding culture of not funding indirect costs. And that's just going to make any capability so difficult to build. Like this is like it is I think crippling much of what we could do in the not-for-profit sector generally. And now you've got this core capability which doesn't tie to any tangible impact. Like in the same way that a program to assist 50 people would help those people. Generative AI projects have this massive like abstract impact, but not a more tangible one. It's just going to make it so much harder to find. So I think this is the biggest, the biggest obstacle to us actually using it to help the 90+% of people who need the help.
It's so interesting, Noel. I'd love to know, your perspective on whether or not in trying to obtain that support, that funding, just to get some breathing room to kind of deal with the complexities that are involved with exploring some kind of implementation. Is it at all helped by, I mean, I know that Annika has just, an incredible program, and there are an abundance of volunteers who can be the human in the loop. I'm curious as to whether or not that makes any difference when trying to obtain, external support. Is that helpful? Does that help them kind of envision a world in which they're not just abandoning everything to the black box, or if that is just kind of a small element in your perspective?
Yeah. So it's like for people who aren't familiar with Annika's model, we have a model where our clients are assisted by lawyers, and those lawyers are all assisted by law students who volunteer and do a lot of the heavy lifting, making and that about doubles the capacity of our lawyers. So by having a law student involved in every single case and they're volunteering, we're not it's part of a university program, so we're not paying them. We essentially have a human in the loop, which allows and we don't have to pay for that human. And so Maya, to your question, I think this has benefits for a generative AI tools which will generate service efficiencies, but when it comes to the cost obstacle, you're still running into the similar issues. Like the project might look slightly better, but you're still running into the same big systemic issues of it's still an indirect cost that people don't want to fund. It's still a little bit too uncertain for funders. Where you do get the main benefits from the student model, or just generally having a human in the loop that that isn't very cost intensive, is
Right.
you can train, you can have an extra layer of like a sense check essentially to make sure that, okay, like this is the general area that the client needs help with. The law student can identify that and say, all right, of these 10 buckets, it's actually this bucket. That's easy enough. And it makes it much more likely that the AI tool will provide relevant information. And yeah, so that combined with the fact that it's cost efficient means that there's like opportunity for service efficiencies for sure.
Interesting. It's something really critical to keep in mind. I mean, as we're kind of in these early days. Let's move a little bit to something we've already touched on, the kind of the risks, the worries, the harms, and we've got some excellent questions I want to make sure to get to. But what bad essentially could happen to the public or providers or policymakers if these models are developed? Laura, I'd love to start off with you about one of the biggest risks that we talked about in people creating biased tools that can be used. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's definitely in this sector, in my opinion, one of the biggest risks because of the cohort of people that we're dealing with, are often quite vulnerable. And we've already seen how bad tools learn from human decisions and human input, and humans are inherently biased, and we need to be aware of that. So in the US, people probably already know about this, but there was a tool called Compass, which was developed to predict the likelihood of reoffending. And it was actually used in the court systems in sentencing. So it was used to help make sentencing decisions. And it was grossly underestimating the likelihood of white people reoffending and grossly overestimating the likelihood of black people reoffending. And the fact that that was used to make decisions in courts is just wild. So definitely one of the biggest risks, but it just involves creating better tools. Like that, it's an easy risk to get over. It just involves more time and effort put into making sure that there's, if you're training on something like samples, like Justice Connect has done, you need to make sure that you're getting samples from a really diverse range of people, languages, everything like that, so that you're making sure that the accuracy is the same across all levels. Because if we don't, then the risk is that we create tools that just further entrench and reinforce the barriers to access to justice that exist for people, especially from marginalized communities.
I mean, we need to fund organizations that are creating this safe, ethical AI.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, should be a primary mitigation strategy. Speaking of mitigation strategies, what about something that is often discussed in access to justice community discussions is whether or not the access to justice community, I mean, in the ideal world, right? Should we train our own model on trusted data? With the argument being that if the public did come to that, they would at least have some ability to trust the source. Dan, what were your thoughts on that?
That's a really tricky one. And when I talk to generative AI experts and data scientists, their view is that everyone thinks they need a fine-tuned model, but that the standard models generally work quite well. And I think, and also the risk is when you start, one option is to build a model from scratch, which is hugely cost prohibitive and resource intensive. And then the other option is to take one of the existing large language models and fine tune it. And I guess it can also, the best approach of doing that is unclear. And there's a lot of examples where people have tried to fine tune models and it's actually backfired. And the accuracy they've ended up with is worse than what they started with. And I don't think it's any way yet to sort of ensure 100% accuracy, because the nature of generative AI is that it's generating stuff, it's making stuff up based on the inputs, and so I think I think it's something worth pursuing. I think the question of how we pursue it, I'm not sure about. So whether in terms of fine tuning, you can. And I think it's a matter of experimentation. So with fine tuning, we can do unsupervised training where we can provide large amounts of general domain specific open source information, legal information from the public domain. If we wanted to work on very specific tasks, we can do supervised learning where we add very specific documents and templates relating to the type of work we wanted to do. We can do reinforcement learning where we have humans who review the data that's coming through and nudging the model in the right direction in terms of what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Or it may be that we just use the base models and we just get really good at the sort of context window we provide, which is that added layer on top that's not actually part of the model that instructs it on how it should be approaching the task. And I don't think one of those options is the right answer across the board. I think it's about getting our hands dirty, trialing different approaches in different contexts and seeing what works best.
Yeah, it's true. And going back to something we touched on earlier, there are, one of the main obstacles to it, of course, is having to maintain client confidentiality and lawyer-client privilege. We had a great question come in about whose responsibility it is to educate clients that can't afford legal representation, that in exchange for foregoing confidentiality or privilege, or kind of donating their privileged information, they may be able to access crowdsourced or open source advice. And sort of in a teach the model, reap the benefits type of model. Do you think regulators need to make this a focus area? Yeah, this is for anybody. It's a very good food for thought.
I think we're just so far like behind the eight ball in terms of regulation to even get to a detailed question like that, which is an excellent question. But I think just like, the issues, like really basic issues of like who is responsible for information that's coming out. When you have a, say, not-for-profit that's using, a proprietary chatbot to inform the legal advice, is it the company that runs a chatbot? Is it the legal organization? Is it whoever fine-tuned the model for that specific context? That there's so many unanswered gray areas in this space. So
agreed.
Lots of questions around, as it stands now, at least in an Australian context, ChatGPT is certainly breaching the professional conduct rules. It's providing legal information as an unauthorized entity on a daily basis to probably thousands of people, but the regulators don't seem to be doing anything about it for now.
Yeah, and then the question really is, well, at least in the United States, the question always then becomes, how informed are the regulators before they're making decisions, right? Well, I want to just jump into addressing some of these questions that have come in no particular order, but then I'll come back. We've only got 10 minutes left, so I'll come back for a quick prediction from any of you that would like to jump in on where this might go and how we can best leverage AI in the future for access to justice. But before you do, so you can think about that while I'm looking through these questions. Privacy and information security, how they should be integrated in efforts to implement a generative AI in the CLC space.
I think we just need tools that use data correctly. Like, there are so many ways that we could create tools that don't store data, that just use it to create a response to the question and then get rid of it. I think there's so many different ways that we could do it. It's just that the problem at the moment is that most of the fear around privacy and data security and things comes from using ChatGPT specifically, and that's because it's the most well-known and the most used generative AI tool. And it wasn't developed with the idea of providing a safe space for people to seek legal information. Data is more valuable than gold these days. So, of course, they're looking to collect as much as they can, and it does help train the model. But, yeah, it's just about having tools developed that are safe to use and that respect people's privacy and data security in line with things like the Australian privacy principles and GDPR.
Yeah, thank you. Another one for anybody. I know that we talked about whether ahead of the panel today, we talked about each of your experiences and kind of stages that you're in your individual roles in exploring LLMs. And somebody has asked, has anyone here deployed their own instance of an LLM and trained it within their own organization's infrastructure? And for what specific purpose was the LLM deployed? Like I said, I know when we were talking about it, people were in, kind of investigatory stages, but if anyone would like to jump in with an answer to that with respect to the status that they are in their roles, that would be great.
Yeah, so Justice Spec in developing their NLP tool used BERT. So this is the University of Melbourne who did most of this work. They used BERT to look at starting to train the tool plus massive amounts of samples to train the model to predict areas of law. And what they did was take those samples and turn them into that. They gamified the process of identifying the area of law and the legal problem in them. So many programming lawyers dedicated their time to tagging up the samples in a game called Tag, where they would look at the sample, say this is the problem in the area of law, and then highlight which bits of text indicated to them that it was that area of law. And so that helps to then train the model to be like, okay, when someone talks about this in this way, it's generally because they have this legal problem. And then that helps connect them to, say, the homelessness service or to the not-for-profit service. So yeah, that's my main experience with it, but I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in.
Well, we can jump to the next question and come back to this if need be. So this is a great question. There tends to be a focus on access to justice in civil law matters. How might AI or generative AI support or facilitate access to justice in criminal law matters, which might shift a burden from the legal aid commissions? I can say that in the United States, we there is sort of almost an artificial bifurcation where kind of people who know less about the issues tend to think of it very, it's either criminal or civil, when in fact there's so much overlap, and the circumstances that might start with a civil law matter might snowball into criminal proceedings as well. So I think that looking at it more holistically, sort of at a much higher level, addressing the issues that bring people to criminal court will probably be drastically alleviating the criminal law matters that are being stacked up in the courts. I think that there's a lot to be said for very specific and very strong, very strong sort of gosh, I can't think of the word, but there needs to be a lot of scrutiny on what AI is out there that is being used actually already in criminal law matters, as we talked about a little bit already. And I think that there's a lot. I know a lot about kind of specific areas of generative AI, but I think they may be specific to the US. So I'll leave that one for now, and we can get back to folks if we have time.
Can I briefly jump in on this? I guess
yes, of course.
A tangential point.
Yeah,
I think one of the variables that we haven't talked about is the stakes at play for the client, and I think criminal law, the stakes are generally so high that I would be hesitant for that to be sort of experimentation ground for where we test out new tools. In particular, in terms of directed to consumer self-help tools, I think where the space for innovation is identifying the areas that have the lowest stakes, both in terms of sort of financial, the financial harm that could come from incorrect information being furnished. And I think that's why sort of the complaint making area, particularly complaints that don't include demands for financial compensation, they're kind of high volume. Generally, there's lawyers aren't available to help with them. Is a really great sandbox for us to try things out. I mean, it makes, there's a project with the National Justice Project, and they always get very nervous when we're in project meetings, and I say, we have a very high tolerance for mistakes with this project because we can get it wrong, and we don't want to get it wrong, but if we get it wrong and we send someone to the wrong complaint body, the outcome generally, in most cases, will just be that complaint body saying, no, we don't have jurisdiction to hear a complaint, you should go to the other one. And so that, I guess that provides an opportunity to be a bit more experimental in terms of how we approach it and try new approaches, where if you did that in the criminal context and you provided the wrong information and someone, deprived of their liberty for, that's a very different equation when calculating what sort of tools or technology you should be using in that context.
Agreed.
I know we're running out of time, but I don't want people to think that we've just I think all of us could agree with this, but we're not just talking about generative AI in terms of tools that kind of replace a lawyer and help a person in need that they directly interact with. I think at the moment, one of the biggest opportunities for generative AI is to scale up legal services. So to help make legal aid lawyers' lives so much more efficient, so that their research drafting, everything could be done for them, rather than like them having to spend all this time. Like you could only help one person at one time, whereas if we were able to use tools that aren't necessarily client facing, but that massively scale up the amount of people that you're able to assist, then that would be a huge relief of the burden on the criminal justice system, but also the civil legal system.
Absolutely.
Agreed. Well, we're at the time where we've 1 minute left. If anyone would like to jump in with a prediction, starting with Noel, I know you had something you wanted to jump in on, and if we have time, to the others as well.
All right. Well, then very quickly, a bit of a grim prediction, but I don't think there's going to be any big, bold, like successful generative AI projects coming out of Australia that are bespoke for access to justice anytime soon, just because of a lot of the barriers that we've talked about. I think there's definitely space for the generative AI to be used really well, just not like specifically built for access to justice. And it's just like, I think it's just still too great a risk for the big funders and too big a project for the small funders. And maybe when it's de-risked a lot and there's more certainty. And I think the corollary of that is when you've got 90% of people not getting the services that they need through the sector, people will start to have more faith in general purpose generative AI to provide them the advice that they would otherwise not get. And it's, that comes down to faith in the institutions and things like that. And I think that has the capacity to start skewing one way, because it's just, so to like, there's another competitor in the market now, as there's getting no help, there's what is available in the sector, and now there's this potentially unlawful generative AI, which is a competitor.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time. I'm so sorry, everybody. We had about enough for about 3 hours of discussion here. So thank you to all my panelists. And I will hand it back over to CLI.
Thanks very much, everyone. Really, really appreciate your input, and what a fabulous discussion that was. And yeah, let's keep that discussion going, because it's incredibly important. I hope everyone here enjoyed the session. The session will be available on video and podcast, so you can catch the replay there on CLI's Free Resource Hub, or on the Legalpreneur Sandbox, which is our podcast. And if you'd like to receive updates about this and a whole bunch of other stuff, please do follow us on LinkedIn and all other social media. I know that there were more questions that you wanted to get to. I also know the generosity of the folks that are here today, and that they would be more than willing to take your questions if you approach them. And I know you'll find them all on LinkedIn and a whole bunch of other places as well. So on behalf of the Centre, to all of you, thank you very, very much. And we will look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.